Welcome to this episode of the Digital Drop podcast. Today, we are going to be looking at the root causes of digital transformation failure within the membership sector. And I'm joined today by the wonderful Lisa Goldsmith, who has spent roughly 25 years, I believe, working within the sector from a variety of perspectives. Welcome to the show, Lisa.
Thank you.
So, for the benefit of our listeners, it would be great if you just told us a little bit about yourself and your journey within the membership sector.
Yeah, no problem. Well, thank you for having me, first and foremost. So I'm Lisa. I've been working in the membership sector for, as you say, almost 25 years. And within that time, I've worked within membership organisations, so qualifications teams, managed membership teams, head of digital and IT, sat on strategic leadership teams, and more recently, within the last 6 years, I've taken all of that knowledge and experience, and now I've come to the other side. Call it the dark side or not, but I've come to the other side of the fence to help membership organisations use all of my knowledge, all of that learning from all of those years as a consultant, predominantly in the digital privacy and data space.
Okay. So, you've definitely got a lot of insights as to how these challenges look both from within the organization and externally. So, to start the conversation with an open question, why is digital transformation such a big challenge for membership organizations?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few things actually. I think predominantly it starts right at the very beginning, which comes down to the organisation, the operations, the culture within the organisation. Um, that then leads on to things like budgeting, decision making, who's got responsibility for what within an organisation, and actually a lot of it comes down to potentially a lack of planning. And really having the skills and expertise within the organisation to bring all of these really important things together and distill them into a plan and a roadmap to deliver the changes that the organisation needs. So digital is obviously a really, really big and core part that's an enabler of organisations meeting their strategic objectives, but it's not the driver, and often that's in quite contradiction. And it's actually looked at as the other way around potentially. So budgets, decision making are definitely a really big challenge for organisations, and then distilling that down into actually what do we need, when do we need it, how do we piece these things together, and that's where um, all of these things need to be put together to set the foundations for the digital, future digital success.
So you mentioned one word that jumped out at me there, which was culture, but I'm going to get back to that. But before we discuss that point, what is it? At what point within these organizations is a collective decision made that, oh, we now need to undertake a digital transformation in inverted commas? Um, Typically, at what point in your experience do organizations make that realization? And then once they made that realization, what how do they go about actually undertaking that journey?
Yeah, yeah. There's probably quite a big difference between how they might go about it and how they should go about it. But let's start with
Yeah.
with going back to the basics. It comes in various shapes and guises, I think. There's often the teams that are really struggling, those that are really on the ground dealing with the members on a day-to-day basis, that are involved, that are in touch with the members, really fragmented processes, those types of things, systems not talking to one another, inefficient use of data, not being able to get their data and be able to do anything efficient with it. So organizations, I think what we see is they struggle, and they struggle over a period of time, and actually it then comes to a crunch point where they say, actually, we can't continue the way we are. We do need to really start thinking about what we need to put in place to be able to move forward as an organization. And that comes in many shapes or guises. That's either driven from the top. It could be collective teams putting a business case together. So we see it happen and take shape in various ways, but ultimately it needs to be driven from the top, from the senior leadership team and the board, and usually that's where we see organisations say, right, okay, what do we do, and how do we go about it? And they make that decision at the board level to and the SLT level to take forward a project to start the discovery process, in terms of defining what it is that they need to do and what steps they need to take.
So typically, the pain points are felt amongst the employees within these organizations because things they want to do take too long, or they can't do them, or they're unable to execute whatever it is that they're trying to execute, and that then drives a process of convincing the leadership that something needs to be done about it. And then the leadership either accepts it or doesn't accept it. Is that the right way around?
It really should be driven from the top. It's not the same in all organisations. There are many organisations where it depends on the makeup of the leadership team, how involved they have been with digital before, where they've seen digital be a success or where they've indeed been where it's been a failure, because that often that gives a perception of the types of projects and how they should or they shouldn't be run. Some organisations have that leadership from the top, but one of the things that I often see is a lot of competing priorities within the organisation. There's lots of really good products. Membership organisations are doing a lot with very little. And those real tangible benefits that people can see, those are the things that often get the focus. And sometimes what happens in the back end that's unseen is the things that are often more neglected, because actually it's not what necessarily the members are able to see on the face of it on the outside. That in itself is a bit of a misconception, because actually they're the ones that have to go through the fragmented processes, like joining, having to wait a week before they can get access to the benefits online and all of those sorts of things. So they do feel it, but it's often seen as less of a when it seems more internal facing. I think with other competing priorities and what they want to put out there to the world, a magazine, all of the benefits that they're offering, it often has to say, well, we need to put the money here instead of here. And unfortunately, it isn't always driven from that perspective, because, as I say, it's not seen as the enabler that it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
seen sometimes, not always, but it seems more of a nice to have, rather than actually it's a core fundamental part of delivering what the organisation has to offer.
Yeah, I think because a lot of these, or most of these membership organizations are very storied organizations with a long history and have been around long before technology was even a thing, before most of them long before internet was even a thing. And we see this a lot in the private sector, where you've got, for example, say family-owned businesses or businesses that have succeeded and grown without the utilization of digital technologies. There's almost always this mindset of, oh, that's just a nice to have, or a fluffy thing. And we see that a lot within the membership sector. And I think it became very prominent when something like COVID came around. Well, specifically when COVID came around, because a lot of membership organizations who were focused around all these public facing events and various ways of engaging with members in a physical context could no longer operate. Um, and I do think that has been a huge catalyst in that sector, where we then saw the emergence of digital within the membership sector grow quite aggressively. But comparing the membership sector with the private sector, let's say, what I find, I mean, digital transformation is difficult in any context, but I do feel that in my experience working with the membership sector, there seems to be a lot of additional hurdles that need to be overcome that we don't see in the private sector, and they're usually driven by internal politics, processes, a misalignment of interest. And you mentioned the word culture. What is it that differentiates from a culture perspective, that differentiates an organization that's getting it right and an organization that's not getting it right.
Yeah, yeah. There's so many aspects to culture. We could probably spend a whole different topic on culture, to be honest. But I think it's really about top-down leadership, but it's also about that collaboration within the organisation as well. Lots of organisations that struggle. Um, there's often a mismatch between the strategic objectives of the organisation and those being relayed to the teams. There's often a lack of collaboration within the teams around actually, if these are the strategic objectives, how are they going to be delivered? There's often not a plan around how they're going to be delivered, and there's often a push and pull approach in terms of, well, let's just get this nice thing done, and no one has ownership of it. It might be, oh, let's launch this new product and service, and actually, membership organisations, a lot of them are under capacity, but delivering a lot with very little resource and very little tools to be able to do it. And actually, sometimes there can be toxic cultures within the organization. There's a lack of trust sometimes within the organization, and actually really it's about having the strong foundations at the senior level of the organization to be able to plan, collaborate, and bring the team on board with you. And that's one of the things that we see is one of the biggest failures. If you can't actually um, buy-in is not the word I want to use. I don't like that word, but user adoption is often a really it can kill or cure a project, to be honest.
Are you referring to internal user adoption or external user adoption?
I would actually say both. I think lots of
Hmm.
organisations don't necessarily focus on member involvement with some of those projects in terms of truly understanding what it is that is or isn't working for them. There's often a lot of perceptions within membership organisations about what does and what doesn't work. And sometimes actually that's based on a small number of individuals' opinions who may have a louder voice within the sector. So we see it all the time. You talked about it previously, the history of some organisations. Some organisations do have that history that holds them back, and there's often a lack of confidence in terms of driving the agenda of the organisation forward, potentially through not wanting um, to sort of alienate some of their membership, which we get, and ultimately it's about getting a collective view of that. So yeah, the culture, internal and external, they do play a key part in terms of how they often interact. Um, but yeah, definitely culture is a really key part. And actually, it really comes down to, as I say, the leadership within the organization. How are decisions made? How are projects, not just digital, but how are things budgeted for? How are the key priorities managed within the organization? How are the strategic objectives set? And once they are set, actually, how does the organization take that, understand what they need operationally to deliver that, and then understand where technology as the enabler plays the part in order to accelerate that and make that better for organisations. And often what we see is, when I say arbitrary figures, that probably sounds a little bit harsh, but there isn't always a well thought out process in terms of, well, actually, in terms of what we need, how much is this going to cost to get what we need? And obviously, organisations have the budget they have,
Yeah.
but actually, organisations don't necessarily step back. They might say, well, we've only got 100K here, and this is what we're going to do with it. But actually, the organisation's ability to be able to distill that down, strip that back, simplify what they do to fit within their budget is often quite hard. And what they don't do is actually necessarily look all the time at the longer term priorities of the organisation and say, well, actually, if we wait a year and do X, Y, and Z, and we structure it in a way where we can spread this over time and we do it in a more structured, a critical path, we can actually achieve what we want. It just might take us a little bit longer to get there.
Yeah, certainly. I always say if you've got £100,000 budget, I would much rather work on a £20,000 £100 a year for the next 5 years budget than £100,000 in a single lump sum.
Yeah.
Um, so once a decision's made and a digital transformation has been kicked off, what's the biggest risk that organizations have, other than obviously spending all the money and not achieving anything? What would you say is the biggest risk in um, undertaking digital transformation and not doing it properly, if there is such a thing?
Yeah. I would say there's several risks there. The key risks are really around, do you have the skills and expertise, either internally or externally, to help you? Um, Also, it's really actually defining the requirements and what you need. The biggest risk that most organisations face is that they don't actually take their operational strategies, translate that into what that means digitally, i.e., a digital strategy, and then be able to distill that down and start to look at the fundamental operations of the organisation. So, actually, what they will do is have a budget that's, whether that's come from informed, it's whether it's an informed budget or whether it's this is all we have. Um, and actually, what we see with most organisations, they don't necessarily look as deep in terms of the requirements. And actually, what that often leads to is is sometimes, not all the time, sometimes picking the wrong platform. Um, some organisations can look at the shiny bells and whistles and say that platform's cheap and it does a lot for what it for 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 the small amount of money. And actually, what they've done is not focused on what the actual priorities are for the organisation. They've might necessarily focus on the bells and whistles that they might want in 5 years, and then realise they've jumped into something that actually it might have been cheaper, but it costs more in the long run than what it actually would have cost them to have made the right choice in the first place. Some organisations often over engineer what they're looking for, and then they end up with a more expensive platform than they actually need, and one that they don't have the skills, the money, or the capabilities to be able to maintain. And actually, what that really leads to is um, what we're seeing more and more in the sector, and it's not a particular fault on either side, but actually there often becomes a bit of a tension between platform provider and the membership organization, because the budgets aren't there to sufficiently look after the technology, the requirements weren't defined, and ultimately things getting put in place, and it makes it very, very difficult for membership organisations to be able um, to to take a more long approach. The projects are often seen as a one and done, and they're actually not. A digital journey doesn't have a start and an end point. It is exactly what it says. It is a journey. And ultimately what we try to do is we work with membership organizations to educate them about actually the fundamental part is the starting point, to define what those requirements are, what can be stripped out. Ultimately, what membership organizations should really be striving for is implementing what they've got in its simplest form, so that they can start to develop over a number of years and do it much more smartly, without actually bringing in technical debt that they can't afford and don't have the skills to manage in the long run. So I think
Yeah,
that's the biggest risks to the organisations, really. Um,
I, I couldn't agree with you more. With technology, less is more. And most of the time, when organizations buy these big monolithic platforms that do everything, including make you toast in the morning, um, they end up using less than 2-3% of that technology. Yet they're paying for the maintenance of that technology. I mean, in my experience, there are no shortcuts, and um, buying these solutions that are easy to sell because they're easy to demonstrate, that will basically take it a single platform that handles all of your membership data, that handles all of your billing, all of your renewals, and does everything out of the box. So have typically been um, the most damaging decisions that organizations have made, because that creates a dependence on that particular technology provider. And I frequently come across organizations that feel like they're being held hostage to a technology provider, and moving away from that is something that just becomes increasingly difficult. Um, when it comes to choosing technologies, we're obviously in a world where there's two directions. There's monolithic solutions, these all-in-one platforms, and then there is what I refer to as uh, best of breed technologies driven predominantly by microservices. In your opinion, what's the more um, likely approach to succeed for a membership organization that's at the outset of its digital transformation journey?
Mm. I don't think there's a silver bullet answers to that, if I'm being perfectly honest. I think all of this comes down to the organisation, their operations, what they need to deliver. What can they not rip up and start again, but how bound are you by what you need to do? If there's, when we think about things like financial regulations, human resource, there's certain things that have to be done. You can't get around that. Yes, you might be able to modify your processes to a degree, but ultimately there's a certain amount of obligations that are placed upon you as an organisation. A lot of this comes down to how complex the organisation is and whether it needs to be. There are such a, there's such a vast array of technology out there, but ultimately, I wouldn't necessarily advocate for one or the other, or even if you've got a one size fits all platform, or you've got three different platforms with the same provider, or whether you've got three different platforms with three different providers, that's really subjective to you as an organization and what your requirements are. And actually, what I would say is that's where often people go on price. Oh, this is cheaper, we'll go for out of the box. And the difference is, do you want to be able to build a tower block, and do you have the flexibility to fit within those parameters, or do you need to be able to build the house with the rooms and the facilities that you need where you need them? And that's often how I look at these types of technologies, because we get organizations where, I'm not going to mention any specific technologies, but we see organizations, even small organizations, that say we're using X platform because we get the licensing for free, which is great. But what they're driving around in is actually a Ferrari. And they might get it for free, but they actually don't have the skills. They don't have the money to be able to pay for an external consultancy or agency to be able to manage those technologies. And actually, then they struggle. And they might be swimming around in 5 to 10% of the core functionality of what that system has to offer. And actually, they could have gone with an all-in-one out-of-the-box solution. It really depends on the context and what they're trying to deliver. If you are an organisation that say, we want to be the leading provider of learning within our sector, I wouldn't necessarily advocate for somebody going with an all-in-one platform that does CRM, LMS, X, Y, and Z all in one. Not to say that it won't function and it's not a good platform, but actually there are learning management systems out there, and organisations don't necessarily make the right choice between, they get put off by separate platforms because of the
Yeah,
integration issues and all of those sorts of things. But actually the right solutions for the right job fitted together correctly is the answer to that question.
yeah. I love the Ferrari analogy because it's not that difficult to buy a Ferrari. It's not that expensive to buy a Ferrari compared to how expensive it is to run and maintain and service a Ferrari. Um, so yeah, I completely agree with you. Now you've talked about processes and something being fit for purpose. Um, what I've found is that many organizations, when they invest in technology, they try to digitalize the status quo. So they have processes that have organically developed over decades, and become the way in which things are done. And then they try to just reinforce those same processes through digital technology. Whereas the whole point of digital transformation is to transform the way in which your organization operates based on what's now possible with the technologies that we have. Do you see that? Do you have that same struggle in your consultancy with these organizations?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Some organisations are doing really, really great things. Some organisations, but they're usually bigger organisations that either have in-house teams or they've got the money to be able to have the external resource to be able to get things done. And that, in my opinion, unless you're a really big organisation, is much more of a rarity. I would say absolutely. We see that all of the time. Membership organisations did some really good things in COVID, and actually, I have to say, it's quite commendable in terms of what a lot of organisations did do. Yes, we saw some very weird and wonderful things happening, but people got things done. The problem is, as you say, because people were forced quite quickly, people have gone from paper processes to we've digitized, and actually what they've done is taken it off of paper, put it into an Excel spreadsheet, and they've got columns which
yeah,
state each stage of the process, and they've not necessarily challenged just because we can, should we be doing what we're doing now? And actually, what we've also seen within membership organisations is people move around, people move on to new jobs. Sometimes people move because they struggle to do their job and they say, this isn't fulfilling. I'm spending most of my time fighting fires. And actually, that historical knowledge, people come in and they might put their own mark on things. So there's a wealth of reasons why membership organisations struggle with processes and to understand what they can cut out, what they can simplify. And as you say, we often get a lot of, well, actually, we don't know the art of what's possible. So, how can we begin to make that journey to make what we're doing better? And it's a valid argument. And often organisations don't necessarily understand how to get there. And we can also look at your processes. What are your must-haves? What are your should-haves? What can you live without? And that's really hard for membership organisations to be able to do. If they don't have someone that's got business analysis skills or someone who can actually really go in and challenge the norm, it's really quite difficult to do that. Um, so yeah, it's a real struggle for membership organisations, and that's why often we see things that are over-engineered or they're underplayed because the key critical parts of what absolutely do need to be done are missed, or the right decisions aren't made at the right point. So just an example, if a membership organisation is saying, oh, we've got really, really complex membership structure and complex membership fees, we'll look at that once we've gone through our digital project. Those
yeah,
questions should be asked and dealt with and made before you embark on a digital project, because otherwise you're going to put something in place that's actually quite costly to put in place in the first place. And someone told me, I don't know exactly where the stat came from, but you can put something in place, and if you put it in incorrectly the first time, it can cost up to 40 times more to then unpick that and put what you should have put in the first place. So there's key fundamental business model and business driving decisions that should be made before we get to those points, and all of those things lead on from one to the other. But organisations will struggle with, whose decision is it to make? How can I even bring this up? How can we have this conversation? How can we collaborate as a team? Communication alone is a huge part of this that actually is often missing within organisations, even organisations that are really, really good culture. People do look out for each other, but yeah, there's an underlying thread there, and it all starts at the beginning.
yeah, yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. It's quite painful to see sometimes. So when we get brought in as an agency, the conversation's often about the what, as in what they want to do. We've got a brief, we've got a finite scope, and that's typically being driven within quite a siloed approach within the organization, and it almost becomes taboo to ask the why, to go above and beyond, and to say, well, actually, why are your membership structured in this way? So I couldn't agree with you more.
Mm,
What many organizations fail to recognize is that the beginning of a digital transformation journey is an opportune time to reevaluate your processes and to ask the why question, and to see, well, actually, how can we potentially improve this. One example that jumps to mind is a lot of organizations have individual members and corporate members. So a member might be an organization or an individual. Little things like an organization is still seen as a single member, and there is no visibility into who within that organization utilizes the services of the membership in what way, and that's such a huge technological limitation because you miss out on so much potential opportunity. So we do find ourselves often advising for a change in the different membership levels and the different membership packages. But without being too, obviously we've got a lot of frustrations. We've seen a lot of negativities and a lot of difficulties. But for the sake of the audience, which are predominantly people within the membership sector, what would be your top 3 tips on getting this right? So if you're speaking to an organization that's at the outset of this journey, and you've got 3 bits of advice that you would give them holistically, what would those 3 bits of advice be?
I would say start with the organisation strategy. So any conversation I have about digital, we don't start with digital. We love digital. I get overexcited about digital and data. All of our team do. But we say start with the organisation strategy, why you're there, what what benefits people derive from being a member of your organisation. Think about it from a strategic perspective. When you think about it from that strategic perspective, then you start to think about, okay, in order to deliver this, what do we need operationally? What are the capabilities that we need as an organization to be able to deliver this? And then when you think about it from that perspective, you can start to look at, well, if this is what we need, what do we currently have? Where are our gaps? And what do we need to do to bridge those gaps? And then from there, you can start to think about the types of technologies that will enable you to be able to do that. Obviously, within that, there's the whole wealth around the budgeting, the planning. You need a robust plan. This is more than three, but ultimately it comes back to how do you tie operational and strategic objectives into digital, and you really need to be clear about what it is that needs to be delivered before you go anywhere near that technology. And actually, once you know what you need to be able to deliver, that's where the decision making comes in, the budgeting comes in. Yes, of course, organizations can't just pluck money out of the air, but actually to avoid that top down approach of, well, we just have this much money, we know we want something better. Often that can be a waste of, it doesn't matter whether it's 5k or whether it's 500k. It's the wrong approach. Yes, money is a fundamental factor, but actually it's not the key driver of what it is that you need to do. So it's really about that critical path of strategy, operations, and what you need to deliver that, not just from a digital perspective, but data as well.
Okay, and is it better to treat this as an event, as a one-off project where everything is quantified and invested in, or is it better to see this as a continuous uh, investment that's going to stay there indefinitely?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say it's certainly not a one and done. The analogy that I'm using more and more often around this is that you wouldn't buy a car and not change the tyres, not service it, and then expect it to um, to be as as efficient as all the other cars on the road. It just doesn't
Yeah.
work like that. Yes, of course, you have to replace it over time, but we're seeing more and more, gone are the days where membership organisations would procure a new piece of technology and then within 2, 3 years think about moving to a different solution. I don't think we're in that, or we shouldn't be in that world anymore. We should be in a world where membership organisations are choosing not only the technology that gives them the capability to grow, but actually, when we think about it, a strategic partner from the vendor, platform provider, call them, whichever name people prefer to use. Actually, this is a long-term partnership. These should be long-term relationships that it's not just about the technology. So I would say absolutely, organisations need to think about this for the long term, budget for the long term, because what we see more and more often is organisations are, before they've even started, or as they start to get into the journey, they're racking up quite a lot of technical debt that they can't afford to pay for. They're not budgeting sufficiently for the long term, which means that their tech stack becomes more and more and more outdated. And actually, they can't necessarily take advantage of all of the good functionality and features that platform providers have. That leads to frustration on both sides, because organisations then have to invest more to look after the over-engineered and legacy tech stack that they've got, and actually that just leads to dissatisfaction right across the board, and it actually can often cause quite a lot of contention between platform provider and membership organisation. And actually, this is about thinking we don't need to run necessarily with this. There are some things that are a bit more urgent, but it's actually, if we've got a 5-year strategic plan here, what do we need to deliver first, and what's most sensible to deliver first, rather than trying to shoehorn something in here that you've got to spend a bit more money on to unpick and then spend more money here doing it again. This is a fundamental part of an organisation's strategic plan, and it needs to be for the long term. Strip out the complexity, and as our motto is, implement simply to iterate smarter. Absolutely. Put it in its simplest of form, so that you can actually make much more strategic, all that agility that membership organisations want. The more simple you can be, the more agility you will have. And yes, it will cost you money, but it will cost you far less to be strategic than to not.
I think that's very, very valuable advice to all membership organizations. I think with technology, there's no such thing as standing still. You're either moving forward or you're moving backwards. So any break in continuous investment means that you start moving backwards and you start creating a bigger hurdle in getting back to the status quo. We could talk about this for many hours, Lisa, but I am conscious of your time, and we're already running a little bit over. One final question before we end this episode: how do you measure the success of digital transformation, or how should the teams within these organizations be measuring the success of digital transformation?
Yeah. Again, it's a really difficult question to answer, but all of this comes down to the strategic goals. And actually, you can measure it from KPIs, you can measure it in terms of doing a time of motion, how much operational efficiencies have you gained. Some organisations can see 50, 60, 70 upward percent of actual operational efficiency. So there's lots of different ways in which you can measure that. But actually, it's if your strategic aims are to grow the membership by X percent, membership organisations want to increase engagement. It's really, you need to define what those measures are, and you need to have the capabilities to be able to measure it. I think from a digital perspective, absolutely, organisations being able to move forward is a success in itself. But often, membership organisations might focus more on the negatives and what isn't working, whereas looking at actually where they've come from and where they've come to. So I would say this is all about, what is the success criteria? How do you define that? It's a bit like engagement. Engagement means completely different things to different membership organisations. You have to define what that is in the first place in order to be able to measure it. But you need to think about, membership organisations need to think about what they're doing it for, where those, whether it's efficiency gains, whether it's outreach, trying to meet the members where they are, all of those types of things. And they need to think about what those key measures of success are. Digital transformation is much, much bigger than just saying, let's put in a digital system and we'll start using it. Actually, thinking about digital first, is digital first the right thing for membership organisations, for everyone within the organisations? Yes, I would say it's definitely the way to go. But actually, we need to think about how we don't alienate certain members or member groups. It doesn't necessarily mean demographics. So we need to think about it more holistically, I would say. And we need to be very clear at the outset what the objectives and what success looks like in order to be able to measure whether you've actually met that, and whether you've met it at the right point.
But the general rule is if you can't measure it, you shouldn't be doing it. Do you agree?
I would say so. I would say so. Yes, absolutely.
So, Lisa, I always enjoyed speaking to you about this because I always learn something. Just when I think I've figured it all out, I always learn something new in these conversations with you. And for anybody listening, I would always recommend you need a Lisa on your team, or somebody with this level of insight and experience. Uh, Lisa, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
I'm sure that this is going to be useful content for anybody out there that's listening. And I look forward to catching up with you, either at one of these events that we bump into each other at, or the next time we do another episode of one of these shows. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.